I don't know about you, but I find my eyes glazing over when I hear that FIFA is in the news again for something less than salubrious.
A number of top officials from world football's governing body have been arrested on charges of corruption just 2 days before it was due to elect a new president.
In all tonight, 9 of the most powerful men in the soccer world stand accused of taking tens of millions of dollars in bribes, cash in a briefcase in a Paris hotel room, wire transfers to offshore bank accounts, even an expensive painting delivered from a New York City art.
A government witness in the FIFA corruption trial reportedly said that Fox Sports and several other broadcast networks paid bribes to FIFA for soccer broadcasting rights.
When it was announced that Swiss prosecutors had opened proceedings on Gianni Infantino then, you'd be forgiven for raising an eyebrow and then continuing scrolling through your feeds.
Criminal proceedings have been opened against FIFA President Gianni Infantino over his meeting with Switzerland's Attorney General. The country's special prosecutor found indications of criminal conduct related to the meetings.
But this case is a little different. In this instance, Infantino is being charged as an individual, not as president of FIFA. But despite this, FIFA seem very, very concerned.
What we're talking about here is the existence of a criminal investigation that obviously it affects Gianni Infantino personally. It also affects FIFA institutionally. And if someone opens a criminal investigation with all the media circus that goes with that, there needs to be a good reason. And we don't have any reasons.
In this episode, we ask, why is Gianni Infantino going to court? And why are FIFA so nervous about it?
The latest pickle that they found themselves in is the criminal investigation launched against their president, Gianni Infantino.
Paul Nicholson is a journalist at Inside World Football.
The body is standing full square behind their president on this, and it's creating quite a lot of comment, certainly a lot of legal comment, both within Switzerland and increasingly worldwide.
You've already mentioned that 2 weeks ago, prosecutors in Switzerland opened these proceedings against Infantino over alleged secret meetings with Swiss Attorney General Michael Lauber. Can you talk us through what this is all about?
Yes, it actually goes right back to 2015 when the FBI and the US Justice Department raided the Barolac Hotel in Zurich on the eve of the FIFA Congress and then issued a set of indictments. So the FBI arrested a number of officials in Zurich. They then left the rest of the investigation into FIFA, primarily with the Swiss judicial authorities. Lauber was leading that investigation as the Swiss Attorney General. And at that point, obviously Sepp Blatter was still president. He was replaced in 2016 by Infantino. So there were a series of meetings between Infantino and Lauber, some of them undocumented, some of them secret. In fact, they're talking now that there were probably 4 meetings. Really, it's the subject of those meetings that is really what's being looked at by the new Swiss investigators.
Let's build a timeline here. This goes back over a year ago to a point at which the Football Leaks whistleblowing project released some information about these secret meetings, and it goes on from there, right?
That's right. It first came out with the Rui Pinto leaks.
Rui Pinto, hacker, criminal, or whistleblower?
He's obviously a whistleblower, namely according to the definition in the 4th Anti-Money Laundering Directive.
The actual first meeting between Lauber and Infantino would appear to be pre-2016, before Infantino was elected president, but when he was considering a run at the presidency. At that stage, he had been named in the Panama Papers by the US as being on the documents of the Hinkes family's dodgy deal for third-party rights ownership, that again, that money had been signed off for Champions League rights and gone to a third-party offshore company.
UEFA concluded offshore deals with one of the indicated figures at the heart of an alleged World Cup fraud, despite previously insisting it had no dealings with any of them. So the emergence of the contracts from 2003 to 2006, which were co-signed by Infantino, oh surprise, link UEFA for the first time to one of the companies involved in the huge unfolding scandal that was brought down former FIFA president Sepp Blatter.
Infantino wanted to find out from the Swiss Attorney General whether he was under investigation in Switzerland because he signed off on that deal and whether that would affect his run at the presidency of FIFA.
So you got this information in the football leaks, and it's later revealed that Michael Lauber is said to have covered up another meeting, and all of this leads to an investigation which itself leads to Michael Lauber being recused from FIFA cases. On top of that, there's new evidence from an unknown source which puts the Swiss authorities onto Gianni Infantino as well.
Yeah, that's correct. The point here is this is an issue not just regarding Infantino, but actually it's an issue for confidence and credibility of the Swiss justice system, which is why Infantino has been dragged into the spotlight in that regard. I mean, not without due cause, but probably if it wasn't for the fact that the Swiss justice system and Lauber was under that kind of scrutiny, then probably it wouldn't have made it. So the key issue here with Infantino's involvement is on these 3 meetings that happened when he was president. The first meeting was documented, and not only in terms of it was an official meeting, but it was also there are minutes from that meeting, and we know what was discussed, or we think we know what was discussed. The next 2 meetings weren't. So what was discussed at those meetings is really what we need to find out, or was what people would like to find out. If there was no problem with what was discussed, because of course there's no real issue with Infantino talking to a public prosecutor regarding his own organisation, particularly if he's offering help, then why were they kept secret, and why haven't they given in broad brushstrokes the detail of those meetings?
And while both men argue that these meetings are innocent enough, obviously, there is the bizarre reality that no one in those meetings seems able to record anything that was discussed in them, which seems relatively unbelievable, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, to put it into English terms, we're talking about perverting the course of justice. And that is actually a custodial offence. It is actually a custodial offence in Switzerland as well, though the penalty within Switzerland is considerably less than it would be in England.
So what is it that Infantino says that these meetings were about?
He's not saying anything. He said that there was nothing illegal about the meetings. His defence from the beginning, well, it's interesting. Right at the beginning, he said, this is nonsense, it's puerile, it's just people out to get me. I'm not even bothered going to answer this, it's ridiculous. And then in the last week, we have seen this barrage of PR activity emanating from FIFA, including rolling out Deputy General Secretary.
Contrary to the situation with Sepp Blatter, where there was obviously something serious to investigate, the Swiss authorities are still looking at it after 5 years. Here, on the basis of what we have been told, there is nothing serious to investigate.
And various other legal bigwigs from Switzerland, basically slaughtering the Swiss justice system and the anonymity of the whistleblowers.
Do we have a clearer sense of what Infantino is being charged for now, then?
There are 3 main points of the investigation. The first is abuse of public office. The second is a breach of official secrecy. And the third is assisting offenders and incitement to these acts. So as they relate to Infantino, the abuse of public office is actually a Swiss charge in his role as FIFA president. And that sort of relates to breach of official secrecy. So has he in some way incentivized the prosecutor to give him information that may be of benefit to one of those being investigated, or indeed whether he's being investigated or not, or if there are people that he would like investigated, which is probably more to the point. FIFA has a track record of excluding people that it doesn't want within its committees and everything else by actually sticking them before the ethics process and banning them, sometimes very unfairly. So it's kind of a tactic that Infantino has used multiple times. In this case, it's much more serious because if he's used that kind of tactic and tried to manipulate the state attorney general, then you really are getting into very deep legal waters because you're talking about perversion of the course of justice.
We need to talk about Michael Lauber. Who is he and why is he so important to this case?
Lauber is obviously key to this. When Lauber was left in charge of the FIFA investigations, there were a number of big ones that needed to be done, not least the stuff that came out of the football leaks regarding the German vote buying, regarding 2006, and the ongoing investigations that he was left with when the FBI left town after the arrests in 2016. There was really basic failures within those investigations, and obviously the contact with Infantino raises questions over a number of the other investigations, not least into Blatter, Platini, and also Jerome Valk, who was the General Secretary of the organisation. There was a further investigation into beIN Sports Chief Executive Nasser Al-Khalifa, who's also the Chief Executive of PSG, and whether he used broadcast rights to further their position and Qatar's position within FIFA. None of these investigations were ever completed, and none of them came to court. So clearly there was quite a lot of concern from Lauber, and there was probably a little bit of US pressure as well on this, because they had left the Swiss to deal with it. So there was this growing pressure within Swiss Parliament on their own justice system, discomfort with the way that Lauber was running the department, not just in the FIFA investigations, but also in other investigations, which eventually led to Parliament itself saying, look, we really don't trust this guy. Though on top of that, Lauber was also had an internal investigation into his procedures by his own regulatory body, so his own legal regulatory body, who came up with a rather damning conclusion that he had been less than helpful in the investigation and that he wasn't a reliable witness on his own investigations. So, all of these things combined together to force Lauber to a position where he is now resigning. That then puts pressure back on Infantino, because as long as Lauber was in position, Infantino wasn't really in the front line. Now Infantino is in the front line, and they're going deeper into those investigations, and so the focus goes back onto Infantino again, and exactly what was the content of those meetings that he had with Lauber.
So you've said that Lauber has been found guilty on various counts when it comes to the way that he's dealt with these charges, and he's tendered his resignation at the end of July. Doesn't this make Gianni Infantino look guilty?
Yes, it does. It really does. It may well be that the amount of guilt, i.e. how much wrong he's actually done, is not as great as people think. But the fact that neither of them are prepared to really detail what they were talking about really beggars the question, well, clearly, if you can't tell us what you were talking about, and as one judge in Switzerland said, they called it collective amnesia, it really doesn't wash. So, they do need to come clean about what it was about, how the meetings came about, and whether they were incentivized. There was this other prosecutor who is a cantonal prosecutor in Switzerland, who is an old friend of Infantino, Ronaldo Arnold, who organized the meetings. Now, Arnold took, as I understand it, up to 20,000 Swiss francs worth of entertainment from Infantino at the World Cup. Lauber was offered the same packages, I understand, but turned them down. Not because he wasn't going to take them, but because he couldn't actually make those dates. So, there is a lot there in terms of compromised individuals to be looked at. And yes, it does make, the original question, does it make him look guilty? Hell yes.
It's important to note, I think, that Gianni Infantino is facing a criminal charge as an individual rather than in his capacity as president of FIFA. What does this mean for the case itself?
That's absolutely right. FIFA aren't named, they're not the criminal party in this, but FIFA's response would appear to be that they are the criminal party in the way that in the last week they have gone into overdrive with a PR response and rolling out their own officials. Ultimately, the implication for FIFA is, when everything's put aside, is that they lose a president and they have to get another president. In the past, what has happened, when Blatter was under criminal investigation, when that was first announced, same with Michel Platini and the same with Jerome Valk, they were all immediately suspended by FIFA Ethics Committee, pending the result of those investigations. Now, the reality was that none of them came back, and I think Infantino is very aware of that. But for FIFA, the Ethics Committee are reluctant to move on removing Infantino, so FIFA will have to go through to the end of the investigation, which could be a long time. Infantino doesn't look like he's going to move, he's not even going to step aside and say to the first vice president, you take over, while this is going through. So I think it's going to be a long wait while the investigation takes place, and I think Infantino hopes to rough it out But ultimately, the only implication for FIFA is that they discredit themselves a little bit further by backing a president who might be guilty of criminal charges and having done nothing about it. And secondly, they actually then have to vote for a new president eventually, and that is always a fraught process within FIFA.
So what does the immediate trajectory of this case look like for you? How do you anticipate things unfolding from here?
Well, in light of FIFA ethics doing nothing, which looks very likely at this point, I think probably we're looking at a very long wait while FIFA wait for the investigation into Infantino to take place. The special prosecutor leading that investigation returned from holiday yesterday. He's the guy that actually instigated it in the first instance. Then he went on a holiday. Now he's back to actually conduct it. I don't think it's anything that can happen within 2 or 3 meetings and be brushed under the carpet. There are too many big questions within this. So I would expect it to go on for some time and not really see anything within 2 or 3 months. FIFA have tried, I think, with their PR campaign to try and create such a storm around it that the Swiss put their hands up and say, you know what, we don't really want to go there. I don't think that is going to happen. I do think the investigation will go ahead. The other alternative may well be that the Bureau of the FIFA Council, which is basically the heads of the confederations, turn around and put pressure on Infantino to step down. And that would be the honourable thing for them to do. I know that there is pressure from 3 of the 7 members sitting at that top table, but obviously you need majority to sway him.
I want to take a step back and talk about the context of these charges, because I think it's impossible to talk about Gianni Infantino without talking about the broader Swiss legal jurisdiction. Why is it that FIFA is so tied up with Switzerland, legally speaking?
Obviously, they're headquartered in Switzerland. Their legal functions are, for the most part, under Swiss law. For the sports law, they go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is based in Switzerland. And the good bulk of their staff are Swiss. Being in Switzerland gives them certain privileges, certain tax privileges, certain ways of operating they wouldn't perhaps get in other areas. But what they are finding now is that actually Swiss justice system is not as relaxed towards FIFA and the way it operates as it perhaps might have been in the past.
So how much of this case can be explained by internal politicking on the part of the Swiss legal system itself?
There are 2 forms of internal politicking here, really. One is internal politicking within the Swiss parliament and the Swiss legal system. And it's speculation, but it is sort of being increasingly spoken about, is that with the FBI, the US Justice Department indictments of 2015 and the lack of progress from the Swiss in those investigations, there is pressure on the Swiss to bring a little bit of credibility towards that. And then obviously that becomes a bit of a political issue between opposing parties within Parliament. So there is probably an element of that involved. You have to also put this into the context that when the financial crisis hit and the Swiss were asked to reveal all the details, the Americans were going after non-taxpayers overseas, and the Swiss were asked to give up details of all their account holders who were US-based. The Swiss did so almost without argument. So the kind of credibility of the Swiss banking system was shot at that point, as it was no longer seen as a safe haven for people with other earnings or other assets that they wanted to keep away from the countries they necessarily lived in. So there may well be an element of that pressure on top of it well on the bigger picture. The internal FIFA politicking is quite interesting. FIFA and Infantino are absolutely convinced that it is a plot to bring Infantino down. And they keep saying this. And they say, look, it's just people out there who really want to have a go at us. And I think that there is an element of that, but it's not without some substance. I mean, I think they're saying, well, the anonymous complaints are coming from people who we don't know who they are, but we really know who they are. And FIFA have been quite unpleasant in terms of suggesting in a couple of areas that they're coming from internal confederation presidents now, and they've even pointed the finger at the Asian president, Sheikh Salman, in what is, with their PRs, verging on a racist campaign of watch out, we don't want the Muslim guy running this organisation. It's absolutely quite shocking, some of the stuff of the PR messaging that's gone out in the last week. There's also the pointing of the finger towards Blatter, and it's just sour grapes on Blatter because we're still pursuing him for that 2 million payment to Platini. So, yeah, it's got quite nasty on the internal politicking. But internal FIFA politicking is never nice. It is always nasty. It always results in heads rolling.
Gianni Infantino made his whole bid about becoming the president of FIFA off the back of claims to eradicate corruption. How successful do you think he has been in that regard?
Not successful at all. I mean, he's done nothing. He's gone around telling everybody we're a clean organisation now. The very first thing he did at his first Congress as FIFA president after he'd been elected in 2016, later in the year he had a Congress in Mexico. The first thing he did at that Congress was remove the independence of the Independence Ethics Committee. And it's a good example of the way he runs FIFA. I mean, I was at the Congress sitting in the press balcony, and the first thing they do is they have this very long involved roll call, and then you go into the sort of the orders of business. So one of the orders of business was the finances, and FIFA then went through a long involved process of how Infantino was going to give all the federations $1 million more, $2 million more than they were normally getting because he had already been so successful as FIFA president. So all the federations are sitting there counting their money. The next order on that was the removal of the independence of the Independent Ethics Committee. So you've got this situation, you get to a long involved money conversation. This is how much you're going to get, all kinds of graphics on screens all around the room. The presidents are not always sophisticated guys, but they're still counting their money, and immediately they're going into literally a segment that lasted a minute and a half and said, by the way, we want you to now vote on removing the independence of the ethics process to people that we will appoint and we will choose, but vote green for yes, blue for no, red for don't care. So, of course, they all vote yes because they're all trained to vote yes to anything FIFA asks for, and it's gone through. And in the press balcony, it's happened so rapidly that we almost missed it because we're still doing the numbers on how much they're giving out to all the federation presidents. We started looking at each other and said, hang on a minute, did that really just happen? Because getting an independent ethics process was a really hard fought for progression by Blatter. There was always this question over how independent it really was, where what they just voted for was an independent ethics committee and function that could never be independent. So that sort of shows you the kind of iron grip that he has over the governing body. It's phenomenal.
So how much do you think this court case is going to set him back in this sort of public image that he's trying to set up as a clean-up act?
The clean-up act of FIFA is, I think, probably still ongoing. The other point really about it was how much of the reform did Infantino institute? He didn't really institute any of it. The reform was actually instituted by Blatter after huge public opinion back in 2011, 2012, after huge public pressure. It was begun by Blatter. It kind of faltered because UEFA, under Infantino and Platini, would not agree on term limits. It then re-emerged, obviously, in 2015 with the arrests. Blatter didn't get arrested in 2015. He still held on to his position. And his integrity advisors were working hard on a new set of operandi. FIFA put together another reform committee. That reform committee, when Blatter was resigned, was actually under Issa Hayatou, who was the first vice president and the president of the African Confederation. That 6 months, while he was filling in before the new president was elected, was actually when the new reforms were introduced into FIFA. So they didn't come under Infantino. The bulk of those reforms were introduced under Hayatou as an interim president. The first thing Infantino does when he's president is take out the most important one, which is the independent ethics, because then it's all out, it's gloves off. He then decided to apportion money in a different way, so the annual FIFA grants that people get now to some presidents and some confederations given out with almost no oversight. You just get your check and it goes wherever you want it. There's no follow-up, there's no oversight. all of those processes that had been put in were just stripped away by Infantino. So it's a mucky situation. The reform has really achieved nothing. If anything, FIFA is in a worse position in that internal politicking than it ever was. There's quite a lot of discussion as to, initially it was a bit of a joke. Infantino is really Blatter 2.0, but actually we're really talking about a much greater escalation of Infantino, and that in terms of the manipulation of FIFA's finances to get what he wants through the people that he needs to have in place.
So to what extent does Infantino's tenure suggest that FIFA is never going to be free from potential corruption in its current guise?
I think there are some good people in there. I think there are some good presidents. I mean, politics is always dirty anyway. The whole point here is there needs to be a separation of church and state. If FIFA politics and its presidents of the church, the running of the state, the commercial side of it, the handling of the money, the oversight of how that money is spent by the individual federations cannot be an adjunct to the president's personal activities as president, because he cannot be used that money as a stick to manipulate federations and regions to his will. And that's the problem. So solve that, and I think you solve 80% of the problems of FIFA.
Paul Nicholson's work can be found at Inside World Football. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.